The Alabama River snakes south to the Mobile Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. It meanders through Alabama, passing towns and cities, fields and byways. And Edmund Pettus stands astride that river today. But in the 1860s, Edmund Pettus was far from his beloved Alabama River, far from his wife and children in Cahaba, Alabama, just a stone's throw down the river from Selma. He was fighting in a war to break the South from the North into a separate nation, a war to preserve the rights of the white South. In 1965, feet were once again marching through the South over a question of rights. On March 7, 1965, over 500 protesters, most of them African Americans, stepped out on the highway in a march to demand their equal rights. And their first tenuous steps were across the back of the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down the Alabama River in Cahaba, a century earlier, Edmund Pettus had been a lawyer. He and his wife Mary lived in a home, there with their daughters Lucy, Mary, and an infant son, Francis. But war separated their family. "But our dear country is a conquered province," Pettus wrote to his wife late in the war. "It may be that our little property has been destroyed. I fear it is so." One piece of that property was quite peculiar. Her skin was black. She was 60 years old, and more than likely helped around the house with the children. But she didn't get paid for that work. She was a slave, property, a human being, owned by the Pettus family. A century later, her descendants, the sons and daughters of former slaves, crested the Edmund Pettus Bridge and looked down onto the highway below. Police cars, truncheons, helmets, violence. Blood flowed over the Edmund Pettus that day, like the Alabama River flowed beneath it. Tear gas floated through the air. Cavalry charged forward and pressed the marchers back. Their bid for freedom, true freedom, seemed defeated. Dallas County in 1860 was about 75% black. 3 of every 4 faces in Cahaba, in Selma, in the fields and farms around them, in that small patch of Alabama, were black. Most of those men, women, and children were slaves, human property, to be bought and sold, like a bushel of corn or a new blanket. But the war, in spite of Edmund Pettus's best efforts fighting for the Confederacy, would end that. The peace that followed would, as it is in many cases, be troubled, and the freedom would be incomplete. The marchers who tread across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in March of 1965 were not deterred. They marched on again and again until finally they reached the steps of the Capitol building in Montgomery, the same building which saw Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy that Edmund Pettus fought for, inaugurated. Now saw marchers for freedom demanding equal protection under the law, regardless of the color of their skin. Eventually, the sons and daughters of former slaves, the men and women whose struggle was christened with the name of that Confederate general, Edmund Pettus, and the bridge dedicated to his memory, would win freedom and another step towards equality. But the peace that followed would, as it is in many cases, be troubled, and the freedom would be incomplete.